The Japanese Zero pilot never saw it coming. One moment, the American twin-engine fighter was below him, seemingly trapped in a vulnerable position. The next, it was climbing vertically like a rocket 4,000, 500 feet per minute straight up into his blind spot. By the time he realized what was happening, the P-38 Lightning had already reversed the entire engagement. For pilots who had dominated the Pacific skies for 2 years, this was impossible. Their intelligence had told them nothing about this capability. And in the skies over New Guinea in the winter of 1943, that gap in knowledge would cost them everything. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. December 1942. Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Lieutenant Jack Morrison stood in the sweltering heat of the primitive airstrip, watching mechanics work on the strangest aircraft he'd ever seen. The P-38 Lightning looked like something from a science fiction magazine, twin booms, extending back from the wings, twin engines humming with raw power, and a central nacelle that housed the cockpit and guns. It didn't look like a fighter. It looked like a weapon from the future. Morrison had been flying P-40 Warhawks for 8 months, taking a beating from Japanese Zeros that could turn on a dime and climb like homesick angels. He'd lost friends, good pilots, men who'd made one wrong move in a turning fight and paid for it with their lives. The 39th Fighter Squadron had been decimated, and now they were being asked to transition to this bizarre-looking machine. "She's a beast," said Captain Tom Lynch, one of the few veterans who'd already logged hours in the Lightning. Lynch had 7 kills to his name, all earned the hard way in outmatched P-40 seconds. "But you've got to fly her different." "Everything you learned in the P-40? Forget half of it." Morrison ran his hand along the smooth, aluminum skin of the aircraft. 2 Allison V, 1,710 engines, each producing over 1,400 horsepower, counter-rotating propellers to eliminate torque, and something the mechanics kept talking about that sounded too good to be true, turbo superchargers that made this thing climb like nothing the Japanese had ever encountered. "How fast does she climb?" Morrison asked. Lynch smiled, the kind of smile that came from knowing something the enemy didn't. "Fast enough to make a Zero pilot think he's going crazy, 4,750 feet per minute. Maybe more if you push her hard and use war emergency power." Morrison did the math in his head. A Zero could manage around 3,000 feet per minute. The P-38 had nearly a 60% advantage in raw climb rate, but raw numbers didn't win dogfights. Tactics did. And from everything he'd heard, the Zero could still outturn anything America had in the sky. "The Japanese don't know," Lynch continued, walking around the aircraft. "Their intelligence reports don't have our real performance numbers. They think we're heavy. They think we're slow in the vertical. They're about to learn different." 300 miles northwest, at Lae Airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea, Lieutenant Takeo Shibata walked across the coral runway toward his A6M30 fighter. At 24 years old, he was already an experienced pilot, with 11 victories, most of them against the American P-40 seconds and P-39 seconds that had proven no match for Japanese superiority in aerial combat. Shibata and his fellow pilots had heard rumors about a new American aircraft, some kind of twin-engine fighter that had appeared in small numbers. The intelligence officers had briefed them. Heavy, twin-engine, optimized for speed but poor in maneuverability. The standard tactics would work: force it into a turning fight, get inside its radius, and chew it apart with the Zero's superior agility. "The Americans are desperate," said his wingman, Ensign Kurata. "Building multi-engine fighters to escort their bombers. They know they cannot match our Zero in true combat." Shibata nodded, but something nagged at him. The Americans weren't stupid. They'd learned painful lessons in the early months of the war. They'd stopped trying to dogfight, started using hit-and-run tactics with their P-40 seconds. If they were introducing a new fighter, there had to be a reason beyond desperation. But the reports were clear. The American pilots were struggling with the new aircraft. There had been crashes during training, engine problems. The twin-boom design looked ungainly, unnatural. How could such a machine compete with the lightweight, purpose-built Zero? Today's mission is straightforward, the briefing officer announced. Enemy bombers are expected to strike our positions at Salamaua. You will intercept. Intelligence suggests they may have escort fighters, including the new twin-engine type. Do not be concerned. Stick to your training. Use your maneuverability advantage. The enemy cannot match your skills in close combat. Shibata climbed into his cockpit, going through the familiar ritual of checks and preparations. The Zero was an extension of his body now, responsive to the slightest touch, capable of maneuvers that would tear other aircraft apart. 11 victories. He was hunting for number 12. He never imagined that by the end of the day, he wouldn't be hunting anymore. He would be prey. The 6th of January 1943, morning patrol, Morrison settled into the cockpit of his P-38F, tail number 42 to 12652, and ran through his pre-flight checklist. After 3 weeks of intensive training, he'd grown comfortable with the lightning's quirks. The cockpit was spacious compared to the cramped P-40. The visibility was excellent, no long nose blocking his view forward, and the armament was devastating. 4. 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, all firing straight ahead with no convergence issues. Green flight, this is Mongoose Leader, Lynch's voice crackled through the radio. We've got bogies inbound, looks like 12 to 15 Zeros escorting bombers. They're heading for our positions at 5,000 feet. We're going to climb to 20,000 and set up for the bounce. Morrison's hands moved automatically, advancing the throttles. The 2 Allison engines roared to life with a sound that was already becoming familiar, a deep, thunderous growl that was nothing like the single-engine fighters he'd flown before. The P-38 began to climb, and for the first time, Morrison felt the full power of what he was flying. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. They'd climbed 4 miles in less than 5 minutes, the turbochargers feeding compressed air into the engines, maintaining power at altitudes where other aircraft would gasp and struggle. Tally-ho, Lynch called. 11 o'clock low, 15 Zeros and, looks like 9 Betty bombers. Green flight, we're going in fast. Dive on them, make one pass, and then use your speed to extend. Do not turn with them. Hit and run. Use your energy. Morrison rolled his P-38 over and dove, watching his airspeed indicator climb past 300 knots, then 320, 340. The Zeros below were in loose formation, confident, cruising at their patrol altitude. They hadn't seen the Americans yet. Then everything happened at once. The first burst of fire from Morrison's guns stitched across the wing of a Zero, and pieces of the lightweight fighter exploded into the slipstream. The Japanese formation scattered like startled birds, rolling and turning with that legendary maneuverability that had dominated the Pacific skies for so long. Morrison kept his speed up, diving through the formation and pulling out below them, exactly as Lynch had briefed. He expected the Zeros to try to get on his tail, to chase him down in the dive. Instead, 3 of them were pulling up, climbing to get above him, setting up for the classic overhead attack that had killed so many American pilots. This was the moment, the test of everything Lynch had taught him. Morrison pulled back on the yoke and shoved both throttles to war emergency power. The P-38 Lightning stood on its tail and climbed, not a gradual climb, not a lazy ascent, a nearly vertical rocket shot that defied every assumption the Japanese pilots had made about twin-engine aircraft. The 2 turbo-supercharged Allisons screamed at maximum power, the propellers biting into the thin air, dragging 14,000 pounds of fighter aircraft straight up at a rate that shouldn't have been possible. 4,700 feet per minute, 78 feet per second, nearly a mile every 67 seconds, straight up into the sky. Through his canopy, Morrison could see the Zeros trying to follow, their noses pointed skyward, their pilots pulling back on their sticks. But the mathematics of energy and power were unforgiving. The lightweight Zero, optimized for turning and maneuverability, couldn't match the raw climbing power of the heavily armed American fighter. Morrison kept climbing, watching the Zeros fall away below him, their pilots struggling to maintain their climb rate as their engines began to lose power in the thinner air. The P-38's turbochargers kept feeding compressed air into the Allisons, maintaining power where the naturally aspirated Japanese engines were gasping. At 18,000 feet, Morrison rolled the Lightning over and looked down. The Zeros were still below him, scattered, disorganized. The tactical advantage had completely reversed. One moment they'd been above him, setting up for the kill. Now they were below, vulnerable, exposed. Morrison selected one Zero that was still trying to climb, rolled inverted, and dove. The Lightning accelerated like a falling stone, the airspeed indicator spinning past 400 miles per hour. The Zero pilot saw him coming and rolled left, trying to evade, but Morrison had all the energy in the world. He pulled lead, centered the fighter in his gun sight, and pressed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupted with flame as 4 machine guns and 1 cannon fired simultaneously. The concentrated stream of bullets, no convergence issues, no guesswork about range, walked straight into the Zero's engine cowling. Black smoke poured from the Japanese fighter. It rolled over and began to spiral downward, trailing fire. Morrison's first kill in a P-38 Lightning. It had taken less than 90 seconds from first contact. In the cockpit of his Zero, Takeo Shibata watched the American fighter climb away from his wingman and felt something he'd never experienced before in combat: genuine confusion. This wasn't possible. The twin-engine American fighter had just outclimbed 3 Zeros in a near-vertical zoom climb. The intelligence reports had said nothing about this capability. The briefings had emphasized that the new enemy aircraft was heavy, that it would be slow in the vertical, that standard Zero tactics would work. But what Shibata had just witnessed defied everything he'd been told. The American pilot hadn't tried to turn with them. He'd simply pointed his nose at the sky and climbed faster than any Zero could follow. And now he was above them, with all the energy advantage, setting up for another attack. Shibata's radio crackled with urgent calls in Japanese. His squadron commander was shouting orders, trying to reorganize the scattered formation. But the tactical situation had already collapsed. The Americans had bounced them from above, made one devastating pass, and then used their incredible climb rate to immediately regain the altitude advantage. 2 more P-38 seconds were diving now, their twin-boom silhouettes unmistakable against the morning sun. Shibata rolled hard left, pulling as tight as he could, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. The Zero could turn inside any American fighter, that much was still true. But these Americans weren't trying to turn with him. They were using pure energy tactics, diving and climbing, never allowing themselves to get slow, never giving the Zeros a chance to exploit their maneuverability advantage. Another Zero exploded to Shibata's right, hit by the concentrated firepower of a P-38's nose-mounted guns. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. The American fighter flashed past at incredible speed, already pulling up into another climbing attack, using that impossible climb rate to immediately reset the engagement. "Brake! Brake!" Shibata screamed into his radio, but it was too late. A 4th Zero was hit, this one by Captain Lynch's aircraft. The Japanese fighter's wing folded back like paper, and the aircraft tumbled out of control. The Americans weren't even trying to engage in traditional air combat. They were executing a completely different doctrine, one that used speed, altitude, and most devastatingly, that vertical climb performance to maintain an energy advantage that the Zeros simply couldn't counter. Shibata made a split-second decision. His fuel was getting low, his squadron was scattered, and 4 of his comrades were already dead or dying. He rolled his Zero eastward and dove for the deck, heading back toward Leh as fast as his aircraft would carry him. Behind him, the P-38 Lightnings were climbing again, setting up for another pass against the remaining Japanese fighters. 3 days later, at the Japanese Naval Air Headquarters in Rabaul, intelligence officers pored over pilot reports from the engagement. The accounts were consistent and deeply troubling. The American twin-engine fighters were not performing according to the specifications that had been estimated by Japanese intelligence. The climb rate, in particular, was far beyond what had been anticipated. Lieutenant Shibata reports that the enemy aircraft achieved a near-vertical climb that his formation could not match. One officer read aloud. He estimates the American fighter was climbing at least 1,500 meters per minute, possibly more. 4,900 feet per minute. The actual figure was even higher than Shibata's estimate. "This cannot be correct," another officer objected. "A twin-engine fighter of that size cannot achieve such performance. The pilot must be mistaken." But the reports kept coming. Over the next 2 weeks, as P-38 Lightnings appeared in increasing numbers over New Guinea, Japanese pilots reported the same pattern. The American fighters would dive from altitude, make one devastating pass with their nose-mounted guns, and then climb vertically away before the Zeros could counterattack. They were using energy tactics with a level of discipline that Japanese pilots hadn't seen before. More disturbing, the American pilots were exploiting the turbocharger advantage. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the naturally aspirated Japanese engines struggled, the P-38 seconds maintained full power. They could loiter at 30,000 feet, far above the effective combat ceiling of the Zero, and dive down for attacks whenever they chose. The hunters had become the hunted. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter aces, would later write about his first encounter with the P-38. "I was astonished to find an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive our Zero, which we thought was the most superior fighter plane in the world." The Lightning's great speed, its sensational high-altitude performance, and especially its ability to dive and climb much faster than the Zero presented insuperable problems for our flyers. The doctrine of maneuverability supremacy, the cornerstone of Japanese fighter tactics since the start of war, had met an enemy that simply refused to fight on those terms. The P-38 pilots weren't trying to outturn the Zero. They were fighting a completely different kind of war, one based on speed, energy management, and that devastating vertical climb rate. And the Japanese had no answer for it. Back at Port Moresby, Jack Morrison sat in the debriefing tent with the rest of Green Flight, going over the engagement minute by minute. Captain Lynch stood at the front of the room, using a blackboard to illustrate the tactics. "This is how we fight in the Lightning," he explained, drawing altitude versus time diagrams that showed the energy dynamics of the engagement. "We don't turn with them. We use our speed and our climb rate to maintain the energy advantage. We dive, we shoot, we climb, we do it again. We never get slow. We never let them pull us into their kind of fight." Morrison thought about the Zero pilot he'd shot down. The Japanese pilot had been trying to climb with him, trying to get above him for a counterattack, but the mathematics had been merciless. The P-38 simply had more power, more climb rate, more performance in the vertical. "The Japanese are still flying with a 1941 doctrine," Lynch continued. "They're still thinking about turning radius and sustained turn rate. But we're fighting a 1943 war now. We have better aircraft, better tactics, and most importantly, they don't know our real capabilities. Their intelligence is still catching up, and by the time they figure it out, we'll be over Rabaul." Over the next 3 months, the pattern repeated itself across New Guinea. P-38 Lightnings would appear over Japanese airfields, dive on formations of Zeros and bombers, and then climb away before the Japanese fighters could respond. Losses among American pilots dropped dramatically. Kill ratios began to shift in favor of the Americans. The 39th Fighter Squadron, once decimated by Zeros in their outmatched P-42s, was racking up victories. Morrison got his second kill on January 14th, his third on January 23rd. By the end of February, he was an ace. But it wasn't the kills that mattered most. It was the psychological shift. For the first time in the Pacific War, American pilots had an aircraft that could fight the Zero on favorable terms. not by matching its maneuverability, but by using superior energy tactics based on that devastating climb rate. The winter of 1,943 inches, New Guinea marked a turning point in the air war over the Pacific. The P-38 Lightning had shattered Japanese assumptions about twin-engine fighters and exposed a critical flaw in their intelligence gathering. But the Japanese wouldn't simply accept defeat. They would adapt, evolve, and develop new tactics to counter the American threat. What happened next would determine not just the outcome of the air war over New Guinea, but the fate of Japan's entire defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The Americans had the advantage now, but maintaining it would require pushing both pilots and aircraft to their absolute limits. And somewhere in the skies above the Solomon Islands, a mission was being planned that would use the P-38's incredible range and climb performance for the most important fighter interception of the entire war. A mission that would hunt not for aircraft, but for a man, the architect of Pearl Harbor himself. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 14th of April, 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Edwin Layton burst into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office, clutching a decoded message that would change the course of the Pacific War. The cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had just broken a Japanese naval communication encoded in the JN-25D cipher, and what it contained was almost too good to be true. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the commander of the combined fleet, the most revered naval officer in Japan, was planning an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message contained everything: departure times, arrival schedules, aircraft, types, even the exact route he would take. Nimitz read the decrypt and looked up at Layton. "Do we try to get him?" Layton, who had known Yamamoto personally during his time as a naval attaché in Tokyo, didn't hesitate. "Admiral, if we could get Yamamoto, it would demoralize the Japanese Navy beyond anything else we could do. There is no officer in the Japanese Navy who commands the respect and loyalty that Yamamoto does." Within hours, the message had reached Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, who took it directly to President Franklin Roosevelt. The president's response, according to some accounts, was simple and direct: get Yamamoto. But there was one enormous problem. Yamamoto's itinerary had him flying from Rabaul to Balalaye airfield near Bougainville, more than 435 miles from the nearest American base at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The round trip would be over 870 miles, flying over open ocean and enemy-controlled territory, with just enough fuel for perhaps 10 minutes of combat at full power. No American fighter in the Pacific had that kind of range, except one. The 17th of April 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Major John Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, stood in the operations dugout, surrounded by intelligence officers and senior commanders. The mission they were describing sounded impossible, but Mitchell understood immediately why they'd called for P-38 pilots. "The target is a high-ranking Japanese officer," the intelligence officer explained, carefully avoiding Yamamoto's name in the initial briefing. "Two Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros. They'll be arriving at Balalai at 0945 hours on April 18th. We need to intercept them." Mitchell studied the map. The distance was staggering. Even with 330-gallon drop tanks, the P-38 seconds would be operating at the absolute limit of their range. They'd have to fly a circuitous route to avoid Japanese radar stations, stay low over the water to prevent detection, navigate by compass and dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of open ocean, arrive at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, engage in combat, and make it back to Guadalcanal before their fuel ran out. "How accurate is this intelligence?" Mitchell asked. "Extremely accurate. The source is reliable." The intelligence officer's careful wording told Mitchell everything he needed to know. They'd broken Japanese codes, and if the Japanese discovered that fact, they'd change their encryption system, and the war would become immeasurably harder. Later, after the other officers had left, Admiral Mark Mitchell pulled Mitchell aside and revealed the truth. The target is Yamamoto himself, the man who planned Pearl Harbor. This is important, Major. The President himself has signed off on this mission. Mitchell selected 18 P-38G Lightnings for the operation. 4 would be the killer flight, tasked specifically with shooting down the bombers. The remaining 14 would provide top cover against the expected swarm of Japanese fighters from Kahili Airfield. Every pilot was a veteran. Every aircraft was the newest P-38G model, equipped with the upgraded Allison V1710-51-55 engines that gave them the range and climb performance needed for this mission. The briefing that evening was tense. Mitchell explained the flight plan, 5 legs calculated with mathematical precision, flying no more than 50 feet above the water to avoid radar detection, maintaining strict radio silence for over 2 hours. If they missed the interception by even a few minutes, Yamamoto would land at Balale under the protection of dozens of fighters, and the opportunity would be lost forever. One more thing, Mitchell told his pilots. The cover story is that Australian coast watchers spotted a high-ranking officer boarding an aircraft. If anyone asks, that's how we knew. We do not mention codes, we do not mention intelligence, we do not mention anything that would give the Japanese a reason to change their communication systems. Understood? 18 heads nodded in unison. The 18th of April, 1943. 07:25 hours. The P-38 Lightnings began taking off from Henderson Field in pairs, their twin Allison engines thundering across the coral runway. 2 aircraft immediately aborted, one with a flat tire, another when its drop tanks failed to feed fuel properly. That left 16 P-38 seconds heading north across the Solomon Sea. Lieutenant Rex Barber settled into his cockpit for what he knew would be the longest flight of his life. 2 hours and 5 minutes of navigation over open ocean, followed by a maximum of 10 minutes of combat, followed by another 2-hour flight back to Guadalcanal. The mathematics were brutal. If they spent more than 10 minutes engaged with the enemy, some of them wouldn't have enough fuel to make it home. The formation flew in complete radio silence, skimming just 40 to 50 feet above the ocean surface. Some pilots counted sharks in the water below. Others counted pieces of driftwood. All of them sweated in the tropical heat, unable to open the canopy windows because the buffeting would shake the tailplane. Mitchell navigated using nothing but a map, a compass, and his wristwatch. 5 legs, each calculated precisely to bring them to the interception point at exactly 0935 hours 10 minutes before Yamamoto's scheduled landing at Balale. If Mitchell's navigation was off by even a few degrees, or if Yamamoto's aircraft arrived early or late, the entire mission would fail. At 0934 hours, as the formation climbed away from the water and turned toward the coast of Bougainville, First Lieutenant Douglas Canning, known as Eagle Eyes, uttered the words everyone had been waiting for. Bogies, 11 o'clock, low. There they were, 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, flying in formation at 6,500 feet, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be, exactly when they were supposed to be there. Admiral Yamamoto, famous for his punctuality, had sealed his own fate. "This is it," Mitchell called. "Killer flight, take the bombers. Everyone else, get those Zeros off them." The 4 P-38 seconds of the killer flight, led by Captain Thomas Lanphier, with Lieutenants Rex Barber, Jim McClanahan, and Joe Moore, dropped their external fuel tanks and pushed their throttles forward. The Zeros had spotted them and were diving to intercept, but they'd made a critical miscalculation. They'd assumed the twin-engine American fighters would be slow in the climb, that they could cut them off before they reached the bombers. It was the same assumption Japanese pilots had been making since December, and it was about to cost Yamamoto his life. Barber and Lanphier pulled back on their yokes and stood their P-38 seconds on their tails. The 2 Allison engines, boosted by turbo-superchargers, screamed at war emergency power, 4,700 feet per minute, nearly 80 feet per second. The Lightnings climbed like rockets, blowing past the diving Zeros before the Japanese pilots could react. The Zero pilots tried to follow, pulling up sharply, but the mathematics were merciless. Their lightweight fighters, optimized for maneuverability, simply couldn't match the P-38's vertical performance. By the time they'd arrested their dives and established a climb, the American fighters were already above them, closing in on the bombers. Barber opened fire on the lead Betty at close range. His 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon, all nose-mounted, all firing in perfect parallel, stitched a devastating line across the bomber's right engine. Flames erupted, black smoke poured from the nacelle. The Betty rolled left, its pilot desperately trying to maintain control, but the damage was catastrophic. Inside that aircraft, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his customary seat, his white-gloved hand resting on his samurai sword. He never knew what hit him. 2.50 caliber bullets struck him, one in the shoulder, one entering below his left jaw and exiting through his right eye. He died instantly, his body still strapped into the seat. The Betty spiraled downward and crashed into the jungle below. The second bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, was hit by Lieutenant Besby Holmes and crashed into the sea. Ugaki survived, pulled from the wreckage by Japanese search parties. But Yamamoto's body would lie in the jungle until the following day, when Japanese troops finally reached the crash site. The Zero pilots, watching their admiral's aircraft go down in flames, attacked the P-38 seconds with desperate fury. But the Americans had learned their lessons well. They didn't turn with the Zeros. They used their speed and their climb rate, making high-speed passes and then zooming back up to altitude, always maintaining their energy advantage. Lieutenant Raymond Hines' P-38 was hit during the engagement and went down. But the remaining American fighters made it back to Guadalcanal, some of them landing with their fuel tanks nearly empty. Barber's aircraft had over 100 bullet holes in the airframe, but flew home on both engines. The Japanese government didn't announce Yamamoto's death until the 21st of May 1943, more than a month after the shootdown. They feared the psychological impact on both the military and the civilian population. Yamamoto wasn't just an admiral, he was a symbol, a national hero, a man whose strategic genius had guided Japan through the first 2 years of the war. His funeral in Tokyo was an elaborate state ceremony. His ashes were paraded through the streets. The entire nation mourned. But the damage went beyond symbolism. Yamamoto had been irreplaceable. His understanding of naval aviation, his strategic vision, his ability to inspire loyalty. No other Japanese admiral possessed the same combination of skills. As Layton had predicted, the impact on Japanese naval morale was devastating. Pilots who had revered Yamamoto began to question whether victory was possible. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already cracked at Midway, suffered another devastating blow, and the Americans had accomplished it using the P-38 Lightning's most devastating advantage, that incredible climb rate that Japanese intelligence had never properly assessed. The mission had required not just range and firepower, but the ability to climb faster than the Zero escorts could intercept. Without that performance advantage, the killer flight would never have reached the bombers. By the summer of 1943, the P-38 had become the dominant American fighter in the Pacific theater. Japanese pilots, who had once viewed American fighters with contempt, now approached every engagement with caution. The standing orders were clear. Avoid combat with the twin-engine fighters unless absolutely necessary. If forced to engage, never try to climb with them. But avoiding combat with P-38 seconds was becoming impossible. They were everywhere, over New Guinea, over Rabaul, over the Solomons. The 49th Fighter Group, the 475th Fighter Group, the 8th Fighter Group, all flying Lightnings, all using the same energy tactics that had shocked Japanese pilots in those first engagements. The kill ratio shifted dramatically. In late 1942 and early 1943, Japanese pilots in Zeros had shot down roughly 3 American aircraft for every loss. By mid-1943, with P-38 seconds flying the majority of fighter missions, that ratio had reversed. American pilots were shooting down 3 Japanese aircraft for every P-38 lost. Richard Bong, already an ace, continued to rack up victories. By July 1943, he had 15 kills. By December, 21. His tactics were simple and devastating. Use altitude advantage, dive on the enemy, use the nose-mounted guns to deliver concentrated fire, and then climb away before the Japanese could react. The P-38's climb rate made it almost impossible for Zeros to counterattack. Thomas Maguire, another rising ace, developed similar tactics. Both men would eventually become legends, America's top two aces of World War II, with 40 and 38 victories respectively. Both flew P-38 Lightnings exclusively. August 1944. The Philippines. By the time American forces began preparing for the liberation of the Philippines, the P-38 Lightning had evolved into an even more formidable weapon. The P-38J and P-38 Liters models featured powered ailerons, dive brakes, and improved engines that pushed climb rates even higher. At low altitude, a P-38 Liters could now climb at nearly 4,800 feet per minute, 60% faster than most Japanese fighters. The invasion of Leyte in October 1944 brought the P-38 seconds into direct confrontation with a new Japanese weapon, the kamikaze. Desperate to stop the American advance, Japanese commanders had begun using suicide tactics, turning their pilots into guided missiles aimed at American ships. The P-38 Lightning became one of the primary tools for intercepting these attacks. Based on newly constructed airfields in the Philippines, Lightning pilots flew combat air patrols over the invasion fleet, using their climb rate to rapidly gain altitude and intercept incoming kamikazes before they could reach the ships. "We'd get a radar vector from the ships," explained Captain William Morrison, no relation to Jack Morrison from early 1943, now flying with the 475th Fighter Group. "They'd tell us bogey at Angels 5, heading 270. We'd light the burners and climb 5,000 feet a minute. By the time the Japanese pilot saw us, we were already diving on him from above." The tactics hadn't changed since those first engagements over New Guinea 20 months earlier. Use altitude, use speed, use that devastating climb rate, never get slow, never give the enemy a chance to exploit their maneuverability advantage. Not every mission succeeded. The P-38, for all its advantages, was a complex aircraft that demanded skilled maintenance and experienced pilots. Engine failures over the vast expanses of the Pacific were always a concern, though the twin-engine design meant pilots could usually limp home on one engine. Thomas Maguire, America's second highest-scoring ace, died in January 1945 during a dogfight over the Philippines. Ironically, he violated the cardinal rule of P-38 tactics. He got slow. Trying to protect a squadron mate, Maguire pulled into a tight turn at low altitude with his external fuel tanks still attached. The P-38 stalled and crashed into the jungle. He had 38 victories at the time of his death, just 2 behind Bong. Richard Bong survived the war, but died in August 1945 while testing a jet-powered P-80 Shooting Star over Burbank, California. His death came just days before Japan's surrender. He never got to celebrate the victory his 40 kills had helped secure, but their legacy and the legacy of the P-38 Lightning lived on. By the end of the war in August 1945, P-38 seconds had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter type. More than 1,800 confirmed kills. Over 100 pilots had become aces flying Lightnings. 7 of the top 8 American aces in the Pacific flew P-38 seconds. In Tokyo, after the war, captured Japanese intelligence documents told a sobering story. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Japanese analysts had consistently underestimated the P-38's performance. Reports filed by pilots who'd encountered the Lightning often described its climb rate as impossible or exaggerated, leading intelligence officers to discount the claims as combat stress or pilot error. The actual performance specifications obtained by Japanese intelligence after capturing damaged P-38 components and through interrogation of prisoners were never properly disseminated to frontline units. Squadron commanders received briefings based on outdated estimates from late 1940s 1942, when only a handful of P-38 seconds had appeared in the theater. By the time Japanese commanders realized the full extent of the Lightning's vertical performance advantage, it was too late to develop effective counter-tactics. The Zero, optimized for maneuverability and lightweight, simply couldn't be modified to match the P-38's climb rate without a complete redesign, and Japan's industrial capacity, already stretched thin by mid-1943, couldn't support the development and production of an entirely new fighter type. The result was a widening performance gap. As American industry produced improved versions of the P-38 with even better engines and systems, Japanese aircraft remained essentially unchanged. The Ki-61 Tony fighter, introduced in 1943, it could match the P-38 inches some performance metrics, but was produced in insufficient numbers and suffered from chronic engine reliability problems. The doctrine of maneuverability, superiority, the foundation of Japanese fighter tactics since the 1930s, had met an enemy that simply refused to fight on those terms, and the intelligence failure that had caused Japanese commanders to underestimate the P-38's climb rate had cost them not just individual battles, but the air war itself. The 25th of August 1945, at Sugi Airfield, Japan. 10 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, 2 P-38 Lightnings flown by Colonel Clay Tice and his wingman touched down on Japanese soil. They claimed engine difficulties forced them to land, but everyone knew the truth. They wanted to be the first American pilots to land in Japan after the war. It was a fitting gesture. The P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that Japanese pilots had learned to fear, the aircraft that had killed Admiral Yamamoto, the aircraft that had dominated the Pacific skies for the last 2.5 years of the war, was the first to arrive in the defeated nation. As Tice climbed out of his cockpit and looked around at the devastated country, he thought about the journey that had brought American air power to this moment. From those desperate early days in 1942, when P-40 seconds and P-39 seconds had been slaughtered by Zeros, to the gradual introduction of the Lightning, to the development of tactics that exploited its unique advantages, the Japanese had never properly understood what they were facing. Their intelligence had failed them. Their doctrine had been based on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong, and most of all, they had never truly grasped the significance of that vertical climb performance. 4,750 feet per minute, nearly a mile every 67 seconds, fast enough to reverse any tactical situation, fast enough to escape any trap, fast enough to hunt even the most agile opponent. Years after the war, Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most accomplished fighter aces with 64 victories, wrote extensively about his experiences fighting against the P-38 Lightning. His account was brutally honest. The P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. Its ability to dive and climb much faster than the Zero presented insuperable problems for our flyers. The P-38 pilots, flying at great height, chose when and where they wanted to fight with disastrous results for our own men. The P-38 boded ill for the future. That assessment captured the essential truth about the Lightning's impact on the Pacific War. It wasn't just a technically superior aircraft, it was a psychological weapon that forced Japanese pilots to fight defensively, to avoid engagements, to abandon the aggressive tactics that had made them so effective in the early months of the war. The climb rate, that stunning vertical performance that Japanese intelligence had never properly assessed, was the key to everything. It gave American pilots the ability to dictate the terms of every engagement. It turned the hunter into the hunted. It reversed 2 years of Japanese air superiority in a matter of months. Lieutenant Jack Morrison, who had shot down his first Zero in January 1943, survived the war with 11 kills to his name. In 1947, during a reunion of P-38 pilots in California, he stood at a podium and raised a glass. "To the fork-tailed devil," he said, using the nickname German pilots had given the Lightning, the aircraft that could outclimb, outdive, outrun, and outfight anything the Japanese had. The aircraft they never understood until it was too late, the aircraft that won us the Pacific. Around the room, 90 former Lightning pilots, aces and veterans, survivors of 100 desperate battles over jungles and oceans, raised their glasses in response. They had flown the aircraft that changed everything, the aircraft that climbed at 4,750 feet per minute, the aircraft that Japanese pilots had learned, too late, to fear more than any other weapon in the American arsenal, and they had lived to tell the story. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.